The mountains outside the window were a blur of jagged white and deep, freezing blue as the Orient Express cut through the Alps. But the real chill wasn't coming from the snow. "Your wife didn't just betray you," I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a heavy load as I looked at the man who thought his money could buy safety. "She tried to murder your children." Just hours ago, we'd been toasting to a restored Peterbilt on a flat car behind us, but now the wine was bitter and the silence in the mahogany cabin was heavy with the kind of secret that gets people killed. He thought he was just hiring a driver to watch his cargo, but he'd accidentally invited a ghost from a past life into his inner circle. The tracks hummed beneath us, a rhythmic reminder that time was running out for two kids who had no idea their own home had become a war zone. You're watching Highway Stories Untold. When the world turns a blind eye to the truth, strong souls like you step up. Drop your experiences in the comments and inspire the fight. The transition from the salt-cracked docks of Hamburg to the velvet-lined interior of the Venice Simplon Orient Express was enough to give a man the bends. Only 48 hours ago, I'd watched the German police haul Klaus von Geisler away in handcuffs for dumping toxic waste in the Baltic, and I'd been ready to board a flight at the Hamburg airport to finally see my daughter Sarah back in Florida. But life for a long-haul trucker rarely follows the GPS. A frantic call from a logistics contact led me to a private hangar where a man named Dieter Hoffmann stood waiting. He wasn't just any client. He was the CEO of a global shipping empire, and he had a problem that only a man with my specific set of nerves could handle. He'd spent 3 years and a small fortune restoring a 1950s Peterbilt 350, a iron-nose beauty that was currently secured to a custom heavy-duty flat car coupled to the rear of the world's most famous luxury train. He needed someone who knew the soul of that machine to escort it across the border into Italy for a private exhibition. I'd told myself one last job wouldn't hurt, especially one that paid enough to put a serious dent in Sarah's college fund. Now, I sat across from Dieter in a private dining carriage that smelled of expensive cigar tobacco and aged brandy. The wood was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the flickering candlelight and the tense, narrow face of the man opposite me. Dieter was powerful, the kind of man used to giving orders that moved mountains, but he looked small in the oversized leather chair. He was talking about the torque specs on the Peterbilt, trying to play the part of the enthusiast, but I could see the way his eyes kept darting to the heavy gold watch on his wrist. "You've done a hell of a job on the chrome, Dieter," I said, leaning back. The motion of the train was a gentle sway, nothing like the bone-jarring vibration of a cab, but my internal compass was spinning. Something felt off. "But you didn't bring me on this train just to talk about vintage engines. A transport driver handles the ties. An expert handles the mechanics. You're looking at me like you're waiting for a different kind of report." Dieter started to offer a polished corporate deflection, but his pocket chimed, a sharp digital intrusion into the old-world silence of the carriage. He pulled out his phone, and I watched the blood drain from his face until his skin matched the white linen tablecloth. His hand began to shake, the glass of brandy in front of him rattling against the crystal. He didn't answer the call. He just stared at the screen, as if it were a coiled snake. "Dieter?" I prompted, my voice dropping into that low, steady register I used when a load was shifting on a steep grade. "What is it?" "My children," he whispered, his voice cracking. They have been taken. From the school in Switzerland. A boarding house near the border." He turned the phone toward me. It was a photo. 2 young kids, a boy and a girl, sitting on a dirt floor with grey blankets draped over their shoulders. Their eyes were wide, reflecting the flash of the camera, filled with the kind of raw, naked terror that stays with a man long after the war is over. Below the photo was a single line of text in German, 10 million euro by midnight. Florence. No police, or we send them back in pieces. The air in the carriage suddenly felt thin. I've seen men break in a lot of ways, engine fires, multi-car pile-ups, combat zones, but the look on Dieter's face was a specific kind of collapse. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He was a father watching his heart get torn out of his chest. He reached for his phone to call the authorities, his fingers fumbling, but I reached across the table and clamped my hand over his wrist. My grip was firm, the calloused palm of a man who'd spent 30 years gripping a steering wheel and a rifle. "Don't," I said. "If they're monitoring your line and they hear a siren, those kids are gone before the first squad car leaves the station." "You have to breathe, Dieter. Look at me." He looked up, his eyes unfocused. "What do I do? I have the money. I can wire it. I can—" "You can't just pay and hope," I interrupted. I stood up and walked to the door of the carriage, locking it. The steward had already finished the service, and we were isolated in the back of the train, just ahead of the flat car holding the Peterbilt. Ransom is a down payment on a funeral unless you control the variables. You need a tactical assessment. You need to know who is holding them, where they're taking them, and why they picked a target as high profile as your family. Dieter stared at me, his mouth hanging open slightly. "Tactical assessment? Jack, you are a truck driver. I hired you because you know the Peterbilt." I pulled a small laminated card from my hidden inner pocket, the one I'd carried since my days in the sandbox. I laid it on the table. It wasn't my CDL. It was my retired military ID. Major Jack Mercer, United States Army. The Redline nickname wasn't just about pushing an engine to its limit. It was about the line I drew in the sand when things went south. "I drove trucks for the Army long before I drove them for myself," I said quietly. "And I spent a lot of years in places where people take things that don't belong to them. Now, you can keep crying, or you can let me help you bring those kids home. But we have to move. We're crossing into Italy in 20 minutes, and once we hit the valley, we're on their turf." Dieter looked at the ID, then back at me. The fear was still there, but a tiny spark of hope flickered behind it. He wiped his face with a napkin, straightening his shoulders. "What do we need?" "Information," I said, pulling my own phone out and syncing it to a portable encrypted hub I kept in my gear bag. "I need the school security logs, the names of everyone who had access to the kids' schedule, and I need to see the original message again. There's a digital footprint on every photo, even the ones sent through burner apps. If they're heading to Florence, they aren't just driving, they're using the mountain passes." As I started digging into the metadata of the photo, a shadow crossed the frosted glass of the carriage door. I didn't turn my head, but I watched the reflection in the polished wood. A woman was standing there, Dieter's second wife, Elena. She was younger than him, draped in a silk wrap that probably cost more than my first rig. She didn't knock. She just stood there for a heartbeat, her silhouette sharp against the hallway lights before moving on toward the front of the train. "Does your wife know?" I asked, my eyes never leaving the screen. "No," Dieter said, his voice trembling. "She was in the spa car. I didn't want to frighten her until I knew for sure." I nodded, but a cold knot was forming in my gut. In my experience, when a high-value target gets snatched from a secure location like a Swiss boarding school, the how is usually answered by someone on the inside. I looked at the photo again. The boy was wearing a watch, a small blue plastic thing. The time on the dial was visible if you zoomed in enough. It was 3 hours ahead of the current time. "They didn't take them an hour ago, Dieter," I said, showing him the screen. "They took them this morning. This whole live ransom demand is a setup to keep you pinned to this train while they move the kids to a secondary location. They're buying time." "Then where are they?" "They're heading for the hills outside Florence," I said, my mind already mapping the terrain. "And we aren't going to wait for this train to stop at the station. We're going to use that Peterbilt on the back. It's got a full tank, doesn't it?" Dieter nodded slowly. "Yes, but Jack, it's on a flat car moving at 80 miles per hour. "Then we'd better figure out how to get the ramps down," I said, standing up. "Because the only way we beat them to the safe house is by taking the old logging roads, and there isn't a car on this train that can handle the mud like that iron nose." The wind screamed through the gap between the dining carriage and the flat car, a freezing alpine gale that tasted like iron and pine. Dieter was behind me, his expensive suit jacket flapping like a broken wing, his eyes wide as he looked at the drop between the coupling. Below us, the blurred grey of the tracks hummed a death song at 80 miles per hour. "Jack, this is madness," he yelled over the roar of the wheels. "The train doesn't slow down for another 40 miles. "We don't have 40 miles, I shouted back, my internal clock ticking in sync with the ransom deadline. I stepped onto the flat car, my boots finding purchase on the cold steel. There she was, the 1950s Peterbilt 350, a masterpiece of polished black paint and chrome that caught the moonlight like a jagged diamond. It was strapped down with heavy-duty grade 70 transport chains, the kind I'd tightened 10,000 times in my life. I didn't just see a truck, I saw a mobile fortress. I grabbed a crowbar from the emergency tool locker on the flat car and started knocking the tension binders loose. Each clack of the metal was a commitment, a point of no return. I was exposing myself now, stepping out of the role of a quiet observer and into the line of fire. "Get in the passenger seat, Dieter, now!" He scrambled up the side steps, his movements frantic. I climbed into the driver's seat, and for a second the world went silent. The smell of worked leather and diesel fuel hit me, the familiar scent of my true office. I flipped the ignition. The big Cummins engine didn't just start. It roared to life with a primal growl that shook the very frame of the train car. I checked the air pressure gauges, watching the needles climb. I reached into my gear bag and pulled out a ruggedized tablet, slinging it onto the dash. "I've bypassed the train's local Wi-Fi. I'm pulling the GPS pings from the burner phone that messaged you. They aren't in Florence yet. They've pulled off into a hunting lodge near the Barberino Pass. It's a dead zone for local police, but perfect for a handoff." Suddenly, the heavy door to the dining carriage swung open. It wasn't a steward. It was a man in a dark tactical jacket, a silenced pistol held low at his side. He didn't say a word. He just leveled the weapon at the windshield. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the Peterbilt into reverse, the massive tires spinning against the flat car's steel deck. The truck lurched backward against the rear chocks, the sheer force of the vibration knocking the gunman off balance. He fired, the round starring the reinforced glass near my head, but I was already moving. I threw the door open and dropped, sweeping his legs out from under him with a heavy work boot before he could find his footing. It was a fast, ugly scramble on the vibrating steel. He tried to bring the gun up, but I grabbed his wrist, twisting it until I heard the wet pop of a ligament. He let out a strangled wheeze, and I followed up with a sharp elbow to the temple that sent him into the dark, unconscious. "Who is he?" Dieter gasped from the cab, his face ghost white. "He's the insurance policy to make sure you stayed on the train," I said, breathing hard, my heart hammering a steady rhythm against my ribs. I checked the man's pockets and pulled out an encrypted radio and a keycard with a familiar crest, the Hoffman family crest. My gut turned over. This wasn't just a kidnapping, it was an execution of a plan from the inside. I looked ahead. We were approaching the curved trestle bridge over the Sieve River. The train would slow to 60 here for the incline. It was the only shot we had. "Hold on!" I yelled, climbing back into the cab. I grabbed the hydraulic lever for the flat car's experimental loading ramps. Dieter had bragged about them earlier, a custom build for quick exhibitions. I slammed the lever down. The metal ramps hissed and dropped, dragging sparks against the tracks like 1,000 4th of July sparklers. I put the Peterbilt in gear, my foot hovering over the clutch. The world seemed to shrink down to the width of those ramps and the dark blur of the access road running parallel to the tracks. "Jack, you can't!" Dieter screamed. "Watch me!" I muttered. I floored it. The Peterbilt screamed, the tires catching the edge of the ramp as we flew off the moving train. For a heartbeat, we were airborne, 10 tons of iron and chrome suspended in the mountain air. Then we hit. The suspension groaned, a violent, bone-shaking impact that sent a jolt of pain up my spine, but the iron nose held. I fought the steering wheel as we skidded onto the gravel access road, the back end fishtailing wildly before the massive tires bit in. Behind us, the Orient Express continued its elegant, oblivious crawl into the darkness. I didn't stop to check the mirrors. I adjusted the tablet on the dash, the red dot representing the kidnapper's location, pulsing like a heartbeat. We've got 20 minutes before they realize that guard isn't checking in, I told Dieter, shifting through the gears with practiced, aggressive precision. I need you to look at that radio I took off the gunman, see if there's a frequency labeled E. Dieter fumbled with the device, his hands shaking so hard he almost dropped it. Yes, E prime. What does that mean? It means, Elena, I said, my voice cold. Your wife isn't in the spa car, Dieter. She's the one holding the leash. The CEO looked like I'd punched him in the throat. No, she loves them. She wouldn't. She's been watching the clock since we sat down for dinner, I said, pushing the Peterbilt up a steep logging trail, the engine roaring as it chewed through the mud. The guard was outside our door to make sure you didn't leave until the money was wired. The kids aren't just ransom, Dieter. They're leverage to make sure you don't fight the divorce she's been planning. I saw the glow of the hunting lodge through the trees, a sprawling stone structure tucked into the side of the mountain. 2 black SUVs were idling in the driveway. Stay in the truck, I ordered, pulling a heavy maglite and a tire iron from the door pocket. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, you take this rig and you drive until you hit a precinct. Jack, 5 minutes, Dieter, I said, my eyes fixed on the house. I stepped out into the freezing mud, the shadow of the man I used to be taking over. The mud of the Tuscan hillside felt like wet concrete against my boots as I moved toward the hunting lodge, staying low in the shadow of the tall pines. The Peterbilt's engine was ticking behind me as it cooled, a metallic heartbeat in the silence of the woods. I didn't have a rifle this time, just a heavy maglite and a tire iron, but I had the kind of quiet rage that levels playing fields. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the lodge, I saw them, 2 men in tactical gear pacing the room, and the 2 children huddled on a leather sofa, clutching each other. I didn't wait for a plan to form. I let the old instincts take the wheel. I moved to the side of the house where the generator hummed, a steady vibration that masked my footsteps. With one clean strike of the tire iron, I severed the fuel line. The lights in the lodge flickered and died, plunging the mountain into a thick, suffocating blackness. The shouting started instantly. I didn't go through the front door. I went through the mudroom at the back, moving like a ghost through the dark. I heard the heavy thud of a man's boots on the hardwood, one of the guards coming to check the breaker. As he stepped into the narrow hallway, I didn't give him a chance to find his flashlight. I caught him with a lead pipe swing of my forearm across the throat, following it up with a knee to the gut that folded him like a lawn chair. He went down without a sound, and I stripped the sidearm from his holster before he hit the floor. "Who's there?" a voice barked from the main room, a thick Eastern European accent sharp with panic. I stepped into the doorway, the moonlight spilling through the windows behind me, casting a long, jagged shadow across the floor. I didn't point the gun at the kids. I pointed it at the second guard, who was holding a submachine gun with a shaking hand. "The game's over," I said, my voice as cold as the mountain air. "The guard on the train is incapacitated. The man in the hallway is dreaming of a different career. You can walk out into the woods, or you can stay here and see how a trucker handles a threat to his cargo." The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the kids. He was looking for leverage, but he didn't see the movement behind him. Dieter had ignored my order. He'd followed me in, and in his hand was the heavy crystal decanter from the dining carriage. He smashed it over the guard's head with a desperate fatherly strength I've only seen a few times in my life. The guard collapsed into the coffee table, glass shattering like ice. The children screamed, scrambling backward into the corner. I holstered the weapon and moved to them, dropping to one knee to get on their level. I wasn't the Redline major anymore. I was just a man who knew what it felt like to worry about his own daughter. "Hey, it's okay," I said softly, my voice grounding the room. "My name's Jack. I'm a friend of your dad's. We're going to get you out of here." Dieter was already on the floor, pulling them into his arms, sobbing into their hair. It was the kind of moment that usually ends a story, but my gut was still screaming. I walked over to the unconscious guard and pulled a satellite phone from his vest. The last dialed number wasn't a local cell. It was a private line registered to the Hoffman estate. I hit redial. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered, calm and impatient. "Is it done? Do you have the confirmation of the wire?" Dieter froze, his head snapping up. He recognized that voice. It was Eleanor. "The wire is dead, Elena," I said into the receiver, my eyes locked on Dieter's shattered expression. "And so is the plan. I'm standing here with your husband and the kids. The Italian state police are 5 minutes out. If I were you, I'd stop packing and start looking for a lawyer who specializes in kidnapping and attempted murder." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, a void where a heart should have been. Then, a soft click. "She's at the villa in Florence," I told Dieter, helping him and the kids to their feet. "She's not going anywhere. I've already sent the GPS logs and the recording of this call to the authorities." "Why?" Dieter whispered, looking at his children. "She had everything." "Some people aren't looking for everything, Dieter," I said, leading them toward the Peterbilt parked in the mud. "They're just looking for a way to make sure nobody else has anything at all." We climbed into the cab. The two kids squeezed into the sleeper berth, wrapped in the wool blankets I kept for long hauls. I fired up the iron nose, the chrome reflecting the first grey light of dawn breaking over the peaks. We had a long drive down the mountain, and I had a feeling the truth was going to be a lot harder to navigate than the logging roads. The descent into the valley was a test of iron and nerves that pushed the restored 1950s Peterbilt 350 to its absolute mechanical limits. I kept the iron nose in a low gear, feeling the massive resistance of the transmission as the engine brake roared against the steep Italian grades, a primal sound that echoed off the ancient stone walls lining the pass. The first light of dawn was just touching the vineyards below, turning the morning mist into a sea of glowing amber, but the beauty of the landscape didn't soften the tension inside the cab. Dieter sat in the passenger seat, his arm draped back over the sleeper berth, where his children had finally drifted into a fitful, exhausted sleep. He looked like a man who'd aged a decade in a single night, his expensive suit ruined, his eyes fixed on the rolling hills of Tuscany as if he were seeing a world that had betrayed him. I kept my eyes locked on the road, my hands steady on the oversized steering wheel, but my mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating the final tactical geometry of the confrontation at the villa. This wasn't just about a rescue anymore. It was about the delivery of a truth so heavy it would shatter a dynasty. "She's waiting at the Villa del Rose," Dieter said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a driveway. It was supposed to be our sanctuary after the exhibition, a place to celebrate the Peterbilt's arrival and the success of the quarter. I thought we were building a life there. "Villains always pick the prettiest places to hide their rot, Dieter," I replied, my voice a low, gravelly hum that matched the vibration of the floorboards. I shifted as the road leveled out, the massive tires humming a different tune on the flat asphalt. I checked the dash. My ruggedized tablet was still live, pulsing with the encrypted data packets I'd intercepted earlier. The receipts weren't just the frantic phone calls, they were the digital fingerprints of a betrayal that had been meticulously planned over months of quiet malice. Elena hadn't just hired local thugs. She'd exploited the Hoffman Group's own logistics servers to track the children's private school transport, leaving a digital signature that only a man who understands manifests, routing, and supply chain security could ever hope to uncover. "Look at the timestamp on this server ping," I said, tilting the screen so he could see the glowing red lines of code. This wasn't a sudden crime of opportunity. She authorized a security audit of the Swiss boarding school's perimeter 3 weeks ago. She used your own company's credentials to scout the target. She didn't just want the money, Dieter. She wanted to use your own power to destroy you. Dieter's knuckles went white as he gripped the armrest. The realization was a physical weight, pressing him down into the leather seat. As we pulled into the long, cypress-lined driveway of the villa, the scene ahead was already framed by the rhythmic, silent strobing of blue and red lights. The Carabinieri were there in force, their black Alfa Romeos forming a semicircle around the marble fountain in the courtyard. They weren't moving in yet. They were waiting for the primary witness and the proof I carried in the cab of this truck. I brought the 10-ton rig to a stop directly in front of the grand stone staircase, the air brakes hissing a final defiant note that seemed to silence the birds in the gardens. The Peterbilt stood there, covered in mountain mud and forest debris, a scarred warrior in a world of manicured hedges and status. Elena stood on the top step, draped in a cream-colored cashmere coat that probably cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She looked every bit the grieving, panicked wife, her hair perfectly windswept, her face set in a mask of practiced tragedy. The moment the truck stopped, she started to move toward the passenger side, her arms outstretched, a cry of artificial relief dying on her lips as she saw me step out of the driver's side first. "Dieter, oh thank God!" she cried out, her voice pitching for the benefit of the officers standing nearby. "The police told me there was an accident. I thought I'd lost you all. Where are the children? Are they safe?" I didn't give Dieter a chance to answer. I stepped into the space between them, my shadow falling long and jagged across the white marble steps. I was a head taller than her, smelling of diesel, sweat and wood smoke, a stark reminder of the reality she'd tried to bury in the hills. I didn't say a word at first. I just reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, turning the volume to its maximum. I pressed play. The recording of her own voice, captured through the intercepted frequency on the mountain, filled the silent courtyard. "Is it done? Do you have the confirmation of the wire? I don't care about the details, just tell me the money is moving." The mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. I watched the blood leave her face, her eyes darting frantically from the phone to the stony-faced Carabinieri officers stepping out from the shadows of the cypress trees. She looked at Dieter, her mouth opening to offer a lie, but the words died in her throat as she saw the look in his eyes, the look of a man who had finally seen the wolf in his own home. "That's a funny way to say hello, isn't it, Elena?" I said, my voice sounding like a shifting load of gravel. I stepped closer, forcing her to look up at me, the Redline intensity I'd honed in a dozen different combat zones pinning her in place. "You thought a trucker wouldn't know how to track a signal. You thought because I wear flannel and spend my life behind a wheel, I couldn't see the rot behind a silk wrap. But I've spent 30 years watching the road, lady. I know exactly what it looks like when someone is trying to force a wreck for the insurance money. It's a fabrication," she hissed, her voice losing its melody and turning sharp and desperate. "Dieter, you can't believe this. This driver, he's a mercenary. He's probably the one who—" "The logistics server pings don't lie, Elena," I interrupted, holding up the tablet showing the authorized access logs from her private study. "Neither does the guard I left tied up on the Orient Express with your private key card in his pocket. You didn't just want a ransom. You wanted to leverage the children to ensure Dieter didn't fight the divorce you had planned. You wanted the empire, the villa, and the clean getaway. She tried to bolt then, a sudden frantic lunge toward the side door of the villa, but I've spent my life anticipating the movements of vehicles 10 times my size. A panicked socialite wasn't going to get past me. I didn't have to strike her. I simply moved with a sudden kinetic grace that cut off her angle, my presence an immovable wall of iron and resolve. The lead investigator, a grey-haired man with the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much domestic betrayal, stepped forward and clicked the heavy steel cuffs into place. "Elena Hoffman," the officer said in a low, formal tone, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, extortion, and attempted murder. We have the Swiss records and the digital evidence provided by Major Mercer." Dieter didn't look at her as they led her toward the waiting patrol car. He didn't offer a final word or a look of pity. He just turned back to the Peterbilt, reaching into the cab to help his children as they climbed out of the sleeper berth. They were small and pale in the morning light, clutching their father's legs as they looked around the courtyard. The Peterbilt stood there in the center of the wealth and the statues, its black paint streaked with the mud of the mountain. its chrome dull with the dust of the chase. It looked out of place, yet it was the only thing in the entire courtyard that felt honest. I stood by the hood, feeling the heat radiating off the massive engine, the adrenaline of the night finally starting to ebb and leave a hollow ache in my bones. The investigator walked over to me, nodding toward the truck. "A hell of a piece of driving, Major. We found the ramps on the bridge. Most men wouldn't have survived the jump, let alone the logging trails in a vehicle this size." "It wasn't the truck that did the work," I said, leaning against the fender and looking at the children. "It was the reason for driving it. Sometimes the cargo is worth the risk to the equipment." Dieter approached me then, his hand resting on the polished fender of the machine that had been the catalyst for his world's collapse and its eventual salvation. He looked at the truck, then at the villa, then finally at me. The power and the corporate polish were gone, replaced by the raw, quiet dignity of a father who had stared into the abyss and didn't blink because he had someone else to hold on to. "I hired you because I thought I needed an expert on old iron, Jack," he said, his voice thick with a gratitude that went far beyond his bank account. "I didn't realize I was hiring the only man in Europe who could see through the fog." "In my line of work, Dieter, if you don't see the fog for what it is, you end up in the ditch," I replied, pulling a heavy rag from my pocket and beginning to wipe a smear of mountain mud from the Peterbilt's headlight. "You've got a long road ahead of you. Rebuilding a home is a lot harder than rebuilding an engine, but you've got the right passengers now." The sun was climbing higher, the heat starting to pull the scent of damp earth and lavender from the gardens. The circus of the arrest was winding down, the sirens fading into the distance as they took Elena toward a very different kind of life. I stood there for a long moment, watching the Hoffman family walk toward the villa, their shadows finally merging into one. I didn't belong in a place like this, with its marble floors and secret betrayals. I belonged on the open road, where the lines are white and the rules are simple. Stay in your lane, watch your mirrors, and look out for the person in the breakdown lane. I climbed back into the cab of the Peterbilt, the familiar scent of worked leather and old diesel welcoming me back. There were still miles to cover, and a daughter in Florida who needed to know her father was coming home. I fired up the engine, the iron nose roaring one last time in the silent courtyard, a sound of pure, unvarnished power that signaled the end of the nightmare. As I shifted into gear and began the slow roll down the cypress-lined drive, I didn't look back at the villa. I looked at the road ahead, where the horizon was wide and the truth was the only thing that mattered. The sun was fully up now, painting the Tuscan hills in shades of gold and amber that seemed too bright for the darkness we'd just walked through. Dieter stood by the open door of the Peterbilt, watching his children eat breakfast inside the villa, under the watchful eye of a family doctor. He turned to me, his hand resting on the polished fender of the truck that had started all of this, his voice thick with an emotion that transcended his bank account. "I don't know how to thank you, Jack," he said, his eyes finally clear of the fog. "You saved more than just my life tonight. You saved their future." "I just kept the cargo safe, Dieter," I said, leaning against the grill with the quiet humility of a man who's seen too many miles. "In my world, you don't leave a man behind when the road gets steep, and you definitely don't let the innocent pay for someone else's greed." I reached into the cab and pulled out a small wooden truck I'd been carving during the long hauls. I handed it to him, a simple piece of pine that felt heavier than it looked. "Give this to the boy when he's ready to learn how to drive. Tell him it's a reminder that no matter how dark the tunnel gets, there's always a way out if you keep your eyes on the line." I didn't wait for a goodbye. I climbed back into the iron nose, the engine humming a familiar, steady song that told me it was time to move on toward the next horizon. There were still miles to cover, and a daughter in Florida waiting for her father to come home. As I drove down the cypress-lined drive, I looked in the mirror one last time. Dieter was standing there, a small figure against the massive villa, holding that wooden truck like it was the only truth left in the world. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, the weight in my chest felt a little lighter. Every road has a turning point, and sometimes the truth is the only thing that keeps us from going over the edge. If this story reminded you that some things are worth standing up for, no matter how much time has passed, hit that subscribe button and join the convoy. We're building a community here of people who believe in honor, the truth, and looking out for the person in the lane next to you. Drop a integrity in the comments if you've ever had to face down a ghost of your own. And if you want, tell us about it. It's an honor to have you riding. I'll see you on the next haul. Stay safe out there.